Good, then I can get started. Sorry for the background noise. Bear with me as I'm next to a very busy road. Yeah, so as Hannah introduced me already, or introduced my research project already, I'm going to speak today about the transition of the ACP Group of States towards the Organization of ACP States. So what I will introduce to you today are some parts of my thesis research that I undertook in 2020 while I was studying at Humboldt University, Berlin. And this is a research project into a political moment of change in the European Union's development cooperation that is still largely under-discussed and under-theorized. And as you probably gathered now from the title also, what I'm referring to is this transition of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific group of states in their own understanding, an international organization under the title of the Organisation of ACP States. And I actually heard about the African, Caribbean, and Pacific group of states by chance while I was discussing the UN Decade for People of African Descent with someone. And over the time of my looking into the organization, researching, speaking to people, I have realized that, like me, many others were not as aware of the group's existence, and even less so actually of its significant role in international development cooperation or its relationship to the European Union. So generally speaking, the ACP, or now the OACPS, is a suprastate organization that clusters 79 countries of 3 different continents and is the main interlocutor for the European Union's development fund, the European Development Fund. But I think to make it easier to understand, this also kind of warrants a brief historical contextualization. So I will briefly walk you through the emergence and the history of the group, of the recent history. So as not that many people know, the ACP and the European Union have actually kind of a common origin story. When the European Economic Community, the EEC, was founded in 1957 with the signing of the Treaty of Rome, France proposed as a condition for its signature the initialization of a common European responsibility for the French colonies. And this condition under which the EEC was then formed produced the first association between what would later be called the European Union and the ACP. So the ACP group, as a result, is a grouping made up of former European colonies. The cooperation includes mainly the access of the EU to the country's markets, and in turn, the financial support through the, as I said, European Development Fund, which was then initiated in 1958. So the group was officially established as the ACP Group in 1975, following the first Lomé Convention, and then the Georgetown Agreement, which is kind of the founding document of the group. So ever since its initiation, the ACP has worked closely, obviously, with the EU and has also remained kind of like the main recipient of, or the other way around, maybe the EU has remained the main donor for the ACP and the main cooperating partner over the years. And the EU to this day finances 50% of the ACP Secretariat's running costs and provides also its seat, which is in Brussels. Since 2000, the ACP-EU relationship had then been organized under the Cotonou Agreement, which is, I think, a bit more well known, but which ended in 2020. And this then caused the discussions on transforming and repositioning the cooperation and the ACP group itself. So in the years leading up to the end of the Cotonou Agreement, multiple negotiating directives, position papers have been published by either side. And then in 2019, 2020, the Nairobi Declaration has been published, the revised Georgetown Agreement, and the ACP announced that to move forward, they had to re-identify and they had to become an international organization. So I am coming from a mixed social sciences background, but predominantly a social anthropological background, which I'm sure also informs the way I am asking questions and where I believe to find interesting points of frictions. And what I felt I was seeing was a huge, so in this case, it was a huge transnational grouping that was about to reinvent themselves and newly identify themselves, and who simultaneously appeared to be marginalized on the stage of international affairs. And this was a group that was also a self-representative entity for post-colonial states. So what I saw was kind of a tension and a contradiction of sorts. And I kind of asked, yeah, what does this mean? Like, what does this change mean? So as I will show, this question suggested a methodology that would focus on the narratives, or the policy narratives, that ascribe meaning to this change as a policy change, and focused kind of on the discursive construction of meaning through narrative. So in general, the public and academic attention towards the ACP group has been quite low. And what has been written about the corporation mainly proposes approaches which analyze the ACP group in its functionality or its influence, or its ability to reach certain development or policy milestones. And what's often missing is a closer look at the specific concepts and imaginations and sort of understandings of relationality that underlie the interaction between the different actors, so between the EU and the ACP, and that also shape the policy basis and the policy production. So as I have indicated, the relationship is marked and has been regulated by the different agreements and declarations that have been passed over the years. So every time a new agreement was reached, a new declaration was published. This was kind of always like a turning point in a way. So policy therefore plays a key role in understanding the ACP group within the European Development Cooperation Scheme. And it is also at the same time, obviously also resulting from its history, important to recognize this relationship as distinctively post-colonial. So this is why I decided for a policy anthropological perspective, which builds on a discursive kind of sensibility. We're also considering critical reflections on post-development and post-coloniality or coloniality. So what this means is, first, that I employed, as was announced, an anthropological lens on policy, or policy anthropological lens. And I would say kind of like borrowing objects of study from political science or from policy practitioners. Policy anthropology, as a sort of transdisciplinary approach, has the capacity to, well, here I quote Chris Shore and Susan Wright, who have written about this lens extensively, to understand to understand the meanings and subjective understandings of policymakers, and at the same time to challenge received wisdom and think without and think outside of the conventional policy box. So policy anthropology therefore offers a perspective that kind of reaches beyond the structural form of policy, meaning beyond like its formal components and its distribution, its measurable performances, and investigates how meaning is created and ascribed and negotiated by policymakers and in policy documents and in the language that is being used to negotiate also. So possibly slightly different from other policy analysis, this policy anthropological lens kind of focuses on the social and discursive construction of policy. And yeah, understanding policy as discursive formation and as discursively embedded means also highlighting the underlying power dynamics and the categorizations. So this is the lens I use for this research approach. I'm concerned with, as I said, the construction of meaning ascribed to the change from the ACP group to the OACPS. And kind of resulting from that, secondly, it means that when looking at categorizations of power dynamics, which are key to a discursive understanding of policy, that the post-colonial relationship needs to be highlighted as also producing powerful categories in and of itself. So my research perspective is therefore kind of informed by approaches of post-development thinkers such as Escobar on the one hand. So this would be a perspective that highlights the social power of discursive definitions of the development relationship on the basis of a Eurocentric understanding of modernity. And then it's also informed by an understanding of kind of like discursive productions of a global sociopolitical hierarchy, and the inscription of like an imperial world order. This is what Spivak refers to as worlding. So I'm kind of working with this concept of worlding and the concept of reworlding, which is basically kind of like the subversive action against a world making of a colonial worlding. And I found that the post-colonial understanding of world making and reworlding as kind of analytical perspectives can then also shed light specifically on these discursive moments that kind of cross the dominant historical framings. And I mean this as a moment of change that kind of like disrupt something. I felt that the policy anthropological perspective that incorporates this kind of post-colonially informed outlook helps kind of like re-embed this understanding of the transition in the global context of European development cooperation, but specifically in this relationship between the EU and its former colonies. So taking from what I've just laid out, I guess it becomes quite clear to me that, or it became clear to me when I was working on this, that I had to operationalize this approach through a form of analysis of constructions of discursive constructions. And the most adequate for my interest in the meaning given to this transition is the proposition to examine narratives, or to examine the narratives of policy in this case. And this kind of provides the grounds for a methodology that is based on narrative analysis and presents policy narratives as the focus of the research also. So as I will just kind of quickly go over the narrative perspective in the case of the OACPS transition makes sense as a methodology for two main reasons. So firstly, I would say if we regard it primarily as a policy change, a narrative perspective is useful because, as Rowe also argues, it enables me to kind of analyze the stories and the scenarios that bureaucrats and policymakers tell as a way of simplifying or also of complexifying the issues that they're dealing with, and kind of addressing the contradictions within these stories. So if policymaking itself can kind of be understood as like forming and translation of narratives, then the method of like narrative policy analysis is kind of this investigation of the scenarios and the argumentations that kind of lay underneath it, or that the policies are based on. And it also means tracing, as I've pointed out before, kind of like the meaning attributed to certain policy decisions and the points of connections between like different actors, different events, different moments. And then secondly, also the narrative perspective kind of opens up the transition of the ACP towards the OACPS as a moment of constructing an identity. So this is kind of like this identity of becoming an international organization, where narrative can kind of be understood as this process of producing an understanding of self. So as a research approach, narrative analysis allows here to kind of perceive what the narrative tellers think of themselves, or like what the identity is that they construct of themselves. So for me, acknowledging narratives as an access point to the political situation due to their embeddedness in, and then also the reflection of social relations and experiences, makes this narrative analysis kind of like a very useful method, or method that I generally really found quite helpful. So my research field kind of constructed itself from this object of study. So I think it, in that sense, maybe it's not obviously not a classical ethnographic study, but more so one where the field site kind of was connected very much to the production of text, and on the other, or like on one hand, the production of text, and then on the other hand, kind of the supranational arena of political negotiation. And Feldman writes about this kind of like approach as a non-local ethnography or like a non-local field site, that it takes place in more indirect or more multifaceted ways. He says it's in dispersed sites and in many venues, and he names, for instance, policy statements, public statements, government brochures, national legislations, and so on and so forth. And kind of accordingly, my archive also constructed itself through this understanding of field. So I was working mainly with documents. Among those documents were the agreements, different kind of like policy documents that were published, the negotiating directives that were published by either side, so by the EU and the ACP in the run-up to the negotiations in 2020. Then the press statements, the position papers, and so on. And then I was also taking field notes throughout the period that I was kind of like engaging with this research, and I collected audio visual material as well. And for example, I developed an observation strategy on relevant websites to kind of keep up with thematic developments and trends, and to see if I could like catch any surprising things, any anomalies. And then in addition, I also conducted 3 quite long narrative interviews with policy practitioners based in Brussels, and kind of engaged with this cooperation, so working for the ACP and the EU. And so all of the material that I collected, the interviews, the field notes, the policy papers, the press statements, the documents, even the recordings in different formats, so in video form, in text form, and the statements and so on. They were all sorted and coded in MAXQDA Analytics Pro 2020. So back then I was using the 2020 version. So I used MAXQDA to kind of like as my main archiving platform, where I would kind of find all the material in one space, and be able to eventually also quickly access specific content, also via the codes. So coding was initially started as associative open coding. So this kind of coding is kind of similar to how in analysis under grounded theory, categories are not pre-made, but then kind of like sought to emerge from the data. So in that sense, a first round would cite the material with a fresh brain. And as in the example that you can see here, in this policy document, or it's actually a sort of a position paper or mission statement of the ACP, I have kind of identified different segments and then coded them accordingly. After having coded the material in separate coding orders, so each piece of data basically in separate coding order, in the first round of this grounded open coding, I reviewed the codes in relation to each other and across the documents to aggregate problem statements across the material. So that would mean rearranging codes in the code system and also color coding them in accordance with this order that I was creating. So you can't see it from these screenshots, but the codes had initially been all in the same default color. And I used the color coding also to kind of orient myself in the code order, the code system that I had created. So yeah, this is another example of aggregated problem statements. So here I have sorted statements that were made in the material into strengths and opportunities, for example. And this method of first coding in separate documents and then aggregating the compatibilities and intersections is intended to result in an understanding of the most commonly identified problems and arguments on the basis of which then narratives can be built. So for this, I would also use visualization tools, especially the single case models or code hierarchies. And this tool basically shows the codes that you have created and that you have ordered, either in general or if requested to a specific piece of data or document, in the hierarchy that they appear in as a tree. So it becomes very clear which topics generally fall together, which topics get mentioned together, under which more general discussions they also fall. So I feel like in this code hierarchy tree here, you can see already kind of the clustering of argumentative lines and problem statements. So this kind of helped me to, not only visualize it as in, I could also use this for actually inside my text then in the end and kind of like show it to my reader, so to say, but also for me to just kind of like realize where the connections were and what the topics were that were clustered under one argument. So by comparing the codes and the code visualizations, it was possible to cluster these narrative themes from which then the narratives emerged. So I already, with the help of the visualizations of the hierarchies, was able to identify vague narrative themes. And I then went in and laid them as codes over the areas where they were relevant. So as you can see here, the narrative themes have been laid out as turquoise codings over the initial codes. Obviously, now it's a bit, maybe a bit confusing to look at because the colors are already assigned. These are all kind of like the finished versions of the codings. But throughout the process, obviously, in the first round, there weren't the narrative themes in the turquoise that you can see now. They kind of like came in the second round. And to understand which elements and arguments actually fell under which narrative, I then used the code relations browser, which basically shows which codes overlap with which I found very helpful. So this is an example of this code relations browser. Yeah, exactly. In this example, it's the overcoming narrative, and you can see kind of like which other codes overlap with the overcoming narrative, kind of making up the contents of that narrative, essentially. So as I just laid out, the principle of reading narratives from the field has kind of relied on identifying thematic patterns from grounded codes. So kind of different from grounded theory, where you would maybe interpret elements. Narrative scholars try more to work with an intact narrative when theorizing it, rather than theorizing components. And then there can be different narratives reporting the same developments, but they're considered, or they are to be considered, as intact stories, so to say. So these narratives are organized not merely chronologically, but they are often they're organized by story. So it's kind of like a story that organizes events, actors, positions into logics and relationships. And the result was basically that three main narratives emerged from my material. And these are the narrative of innovation, the narrative of overcoming, and the narrative of success. So I will not go too much into detail with the narratives I've found, just because I think it would take a bit too long. But I will just quickly go over them and then state what this kind of led me to conclude. And feel free to look at the slides that were uploaded also to read up on how exactly I described the narrative specifically. So first, the narrative of innovation. Here again, this is the code relations browser for the narrative of innovation, so to say. This narrative basically positions the new OACPS as an innovative force or an opportunity for or an opportunity to solve multilateralism and anti-climate change action issues. Just like this, kind of like the brief summary of it. Then here is, as I've just shown earlier before, the code relations browser of the narrative of overcoming. And this narrative kind of tells the OACPS transition as a story of economic and political emancipation. And then finally, the code relations browser of the narrative of success. And this narrative positions the OACPS or the OACP's transition kind of as a manifestation of a successful trajectory. So they are quite different from each other. As maybe hasn't become as evident from now, me going quite quickly through the narratives, but definitely if you would read into them a little bit, there's a certain contradiction among the different narratives that have emerged, and especially the narrative of success and the narrative of overcoming kind of presuppose quite different starting conditions. But so in my analysis through the perspective of worlding and reworlding, it then becomes kind of visible what they actually have in common. And that is that these narratives of the transition, by reorganizing the ACP EU cooperation in new narrations and new storylines, ascribe new roles onto the European partner in the relationship, and also reposition the OACP as an actor of significance with a new standing and like a new mission, a new future. So this makes evident kind of how, by understanding the narratives through a lens of reworlding and the contradictions amongst them, more as kind of like variations and less as contradictions. These stories kind of all point to one uniting or one unifying story, which is basically that of unsettling the hegemonial understanding of the ACP-EU relationship. And this kind of is the meta policy narrative under which the transition emerges, or under which the transition can be seen to stand. So that was basically kind of like the takeaway now in a very like quick run through, but kind of this unsettling of the hegemonial understanding of the ACP-EU relationship. So as I have talked about now for quite a while, I have used MAXQDA to do a narrative analysis over a range of different interrelated, but I guess differently formatted material. And I think the coding system and the visualization tools are extremely intuitive and have helped me to make a lot of sense, or maybe even make more sense, and discover new connections across the material and across the field. But I guess, or not but as I have shown, my project is concerned mainly with text, or to a large extent with text. And the policy documents and statements made up a very important part of the analysis. And their importance obviously also was suggested by the political role that they've played in shaping the ACP-EU relationship as well. Of course, the tools are limited in the sense that they will not look for patterns by themselves, and especially maybe with other existing freehand tools to arrange elements and codings in MAXQDA. There's always a risk of a confirmation bias, which I think needs to be accounted for, especially in narrative analysis. And then also maybe one other thing that I noted was kind of that a comparative analysis of themes and trends through a lexical search analysis, so a word search basically, which is also a tool that is provided by the program, was not really as gainful as I had hoped initially, because the wording differed quite a lot between interviews and policy texts and just the different forms of material. So I found that the free-handed coding was a lot more effective for me. And yeah, I found especially that the single case model hierarchies and the code relations browser, which are both to a degree automated functions of the program, have helped me to visualize and even see new connections and overlaps that I possibly otherwise would not have noted. Yeah, and here are just some of the sources that I mentioned, some of the text that I mentioned in the presentation. And that's that for me. I guess we can now go to questions if you have any.
For your presentation. was very rich and exciting, and adding new views on this conference. We learned something new. So Eve Pinsker, and if you have a look into the chat, there's a question from Eve Pinsker. Maybe you want to answer that.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Eve. So as I'm taking it, you were asking whether like what countries are included in the ACP. No, yeah, the US Associated Pacific States aren't included in the ACP. The ACP is really made up of 79 countries, which have all been former European colonies, which yeah sounds maybe a bit outdated, but I think it's kind of important to highlight this because the economic relationships, obviously, that have been established in that time still kind of like mark the relationship now and are also the reason why. I mean, these are still like main trade partners, so the EU and the ACP countries. This is kind of like a continuation or like a definitely yeah a continuation of an economic relationship, to say the least. So I guess the countries who hadn't been associated in the same way maybe weren't considered um, to be part of the grouping. But it also has to be noted that the grouping is still growing. So I think 2020 they even saw they saw the last admission to the group. I'm not quite sure now which country it was, but one on the African continent. So yeah, we will see which other countries might be included over time. But I guess one of the criticisms is also that's like put forth towards the ACP or the OACPS is that it kind of like umbrellas a lot of different countries with a lot of different economic interests, different cultures, different um, like social interests also under this organization that then imposes these kind of like unified um, policies or like these unified strategies. So now, I mean, this is obviously my research is 2 years old already. Since then, the negotiations have also ended. And the new agreement has kind of like split this up a little bit. So these three regional groups of the ACP, the African, the Pacific, and the Caribbean group, they have all been assigned slightly different strategies now to kind of make the policies and the channels of financing a bit more specific to the needs of the regions. But yeah, as I said, like there are the discussion, I guess, is kind of like controversial. There are people who say this is a divide and conquer strategy and it's kind of weakening the ACP group, and then there are people who are saying this is more appropriate because obviously these regions are quite different. But yeah, so I don't know if that answers the questions or the question. Okay, then there's another, the code relations browser you have. You can talk about how you visualize it. Yes. So, I mean, the code relations browser is a function in itself. So it will, that's what I meant when I said earlier that these are like kind of like automated, not as manual functions of the program. So you can basically choose a document or a piece of data, or it can also be a whole folder. It can also be, I think, all of your data, but then maybe it becomes a bit confusing because there are just a lot of codes. And then from whatever database you've kind of like chosen or whatever piece of data you've chosen, the program will produce this code relations browser showing like it into relation to like one main code that you have to choose. So it will basically show how a bunch of codes are connected to this one, or like not how, but like that a bunch of codes are connected to this one code. So for me, that kind of meant when I in the second round had identified these narrative themes and had kind of like laid them over the rest of the codings. that the code relations browser would show me where, if I would choose a narrative theme, which other codes this narrative theme would kind of like coincide with. So that means that instead of having to note this down manually, or kind of like having to remember it, or even look it up in the documents again and again, I would see like in one view which topics are part of this narrative, if that makes sense. And then obviously the codes, as they are attributed to a certain like piece of text, so you mark the text in the document and then attribute the code. As soon as you go onto the code, as you click onto the code, you can actually see the pieces of text that are marked with this code. So kind of like in a hierarchized order, you could click from the narrative theme onto the codes that are associated with the narrative theme, and then see from these codes which text pieces are actually part of it. So this kind of like makes writing up the narratives in the end a lot easier, because you can just kind of click your way through and just like see what it is about, and then you just have to write it out. Basically, the connections are already made more or less by the program. Okay, I don't know if there are other questions right now.
Compliments are flying in. Yeah, thank you so much for your session. If anyone has a question, you can write in the chat. The session is open for a few more minutes. Apart from that, you can look forward to a Turkish spotlight session and a Brazilian, Portuguese spotlight session, and one English spotlight session. Okay. Thank you so much, Charlotte, and good luck with your master's and PhD.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay, thanks for having me. Bye.
Bye.